Christina, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. And today we're going to talk about reporting that you did earlier this week about the ongoing debate over whether the state should increase mass transit funding. And for policymakers who are supportive of boosting funding for these systems, they have a very clear and simple message, and it's that everywhere in the state, rural and urban, will suffer if the state does not come up with more money. So tell us a little bit more about what they mean.
Yeah, so Mike Carroll, who's the secretary of PennDOT, was speaking in Pittsburgh in front of some Democratic policymakers. And he said, without question, that the rural regions of the state are economically dependent on specifically mostly Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. He said that those 6 counties, the 5 serving SEPTA, and then Allegheny County, which Pittsburgh Regional Transit serves, are essential to the economic functioning of the entire state. And an example he gave was he's from Sullivan County, which we've talked about a lot. It's a very small population county in rural Northeast Pennsylvania. I think there's less than 6,000 people there. So he said basically for every dollar that people in places like Sullivan County are paying towards taxes, they're getting more than $1 back. And he didn't have an exact statistic on this, but said that he imagined that for people in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, they're actually getting less than their $1 back in terms of how far their tax money goes. So, there's certainly a lot of truth to that. The economy is very much reliant on our major industry centers, but that is not something that the entire legislature is really in agreement on, especially in terms of transit funding. I think there have been a lot of objections to the amount that the state puts towards things like SEPTA. They think they should be more self-sufficient, specifically Republican senators who have kind of blocked funding in the past are kind of demanding that they do more to make it safer, to really control what's happening there so that it's not such an expensive task.
I think when people outside of the cities think about mass transit, I know my mind automatically goes to just using it to visit downtown or maybe to go to a football game or things like that. But really, it's something that people rely on for a lot more than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people use mass transit to get to work, and that's the main thing. And if people can't get to work, then that economy doesn't work. Beyond that, it's a major resource for the elderly, which is an especially relevant point in Pittsburgh. So we had someone representing aging in Pittsburgh and was talking about that region is the second oldest in the country after Palm Beach, Florida. And a lot of those people have lived in the communities that they've lived in for most of their lives. And so for them to be able to get out there and go to the grocery store or go to the senior center or see people, they're relying on public transit, and they're also relying on fixed incomes. So if you were to raise fares to try to make up some of the gap of needed money in these transit systems, then you're going to actually exclude a lot of people who rely on it. A lot of lower income people also rely on it to get to work. But beyond that, even in Pittsburgh, we saw a representative from Duolingo, which is like this huge education tech company. And they have about 450 employees in Pittsburgh. And she said that less than half drive to work. And that's an especially important point for younger people. Younger people tend to be concerned about the environment. They have lower car ownership rates, which also, of course, has to do with the economy and affordability. But it's a huge draw to live in an urban center that you can get around easily without having to drive. And so they're saying that it also, improves the appeal of our cities to have working, efficient, and comprehensive public transit that can get you more than just like 2 routes that, in fact, at one point there was a hospital that wasn't even accessible by public transit in Pittsburgh, which is, clearly a pretty big problem.
And so I think another thing too that is important to realize is that yes, Pennsylvania has a really big problem with crumbling infrastructure. And I think that you might have mentioned that that's one of the things that Republicans have said, that, increasing money for mass transit is important, but so we have a lot of transportation problems. And so I think too, and you can go into this a little bit more, how much more money does the governor want to spend on mass transit? And what if people in those urban centers don't use roads and bridges in the same way that the rest of the state does, then isn't it important to note that their taxes also support the rest of the state too, right? Like there is that balance there.
Mm-hmm. I will say that mass transit does use the roads and bridges too, right? So we have a lot of buses and they need that too. So I don't think that people who are arguing for mass transit funding are arguing against repairing roads and bridges by any means. But the proposal that Governor Shapiro has made for this budget cycle and to help stave off what's happened before, where it turns into like we're running out of funding and then we're coming up with a solution and then we're running out of funding and we need like a long-term solution that doesn't need to be debated in the legislature every 6 months or every year, because as we've seen, the legislature isn't necessarily cooperative. So he has suggested taking 1.75% of the state sales tax and putting that towards transit. He's not suggesting raising the sales tax. He's just suggesting carving out the specific 1.75%, which I think would amount to about $292 million additional funding towards transit. That is one angle. PRT and SEPTA probably need even more than that. And this is an issue that we're seeing not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country. So these issues with infrastructure and with transit have really been pervasive everywhere. And especially since COVID, that really changed the way people were using transit, and also really demonstrated why fare-based solutions aren't necessarily practical, because if you have something like a pandemic and then people aren't paying the fares, you still need to be able to maintain the system, especially for, essential workers and people like that who need to get to hospitals and grocery stores and all these places that we need. But to that end, yes, Pennsylvania has a ton of roads. It has a ton of bridges and it needs work on that. So I think, people are advocating for fund mass transit more and fund PennDOT more to fix that stuff. But certainly, you can see why there is frustration in rural areas, even if they are economically dependent on the urban areas. That doesn't change the fact that, it doesn't impact in an obvious way their day-to-day lives to have more funding for SEPTA. Though all 67 counties do have some sort of transit system.
All right, Christina, thanks for joining us today. To keep up with this story and more, check us out on thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thanks, yeah.